Welcome back to all of you. In today's video, we will know about some literary terms from the book Glossary of Literary Terms written by M.H. Abrams. So let us start with act and scene. An act is a major division in the action of a play. In England, this division was introduced by Elizabethan dramatists who imitated ancient Roman plays by structuring the action into 5 acts. Late in the 19th century, a number of writers followed the example of Chekhov and Ibsen by constructing plays in 4 acts. In the 20th century, the most common form of traditional non musical dramas has been 3 acts. Acts are often subdivided into scenes, which in modern plays usually consist of units of action in which there is no change of place or break in the continuity of time. Some recent plays dispense with the division into acts and are structured as a sequence of scenes or episodes. In the conventional theatre with a proscenium arc, that frames the front of the stage, the end of scene is usually indicated by the dropped curtain or a dimming of the lights, and the end of an act by dropped curtain and an intermission. Second term is aesthetic ideology. Aesthetic ideology was a term applied by the deconstructive theorist Paul Deman in his later writings to describe the seductive appeal of aesthetic experience, in which he claimed form and meaning, perception and understanding, and cognition and desire are misleadingly and sometimes dangerously conflated, and such a conflation, he held, is manifested in some formulations of Nazi politics as an artful remaking of the state. In D. Mann's view, the concept of aesthetic came to stand for all organists' approaches not only to art but to politics and culture as well. The experience of literature, he argued, minimizes the temptation of aesthetic ideology to confuse sensory experience with understanding, since literature represents the world in such a way that neither meaning nor sense experience is directly perceptible. In the ideology of the aesthetic, published in 1990, the Marxist theorist Terry Eggleton presented a history and critique of the aesthetic, noting the many ideological perversions and distortions of the concept, originally articulated in terms of freedom and pleasure, and therefore possessing an emancipatory potential for humankind. The aesthetic has often been appropriated by the political right so as to represent the essence of a reactionary ideology, which works most efficiently, even it seems not to be working at all. Third term is aestheticism. In his Latin treatise entitled Aesthetica, published in 1750, the German philosopher Alexander Baumgarten applied the term aesthetica to the arts, of which the aesthetic end is the perfection of sensuous cognition. As such, this is beauty. In present uses, aesthetics, from the Greek pertaining to sense perception, it designates the systematic study of all the fine arts as well as of the nature of beauty in any object, whether natural or artificial. Aestheticism, or alternatively the aesthetic movement, was a European phenomenon during the latter part of the 19th century that had its chief headquarters in France. In opposition to the dominance of scientific thinking and in defiance of widespread indifference or hostility of the middle class society of their time to any art that was not useful or did not teach moral values, French writers developed the view that work of art is supreme value among human products, precisely because it is self-sufficient and has no use of moral aim outside its own being. The end of work of art is simply to exist in its formal perfections, that is, to be beautiful and to be contemplated as an end in itself. A rallying cry of aestheticism became the phrase "I art, poor art," means art for art's sake. The historical roots of aestheticism are in the views proposed by German philosopher Immanuel Kant in his Critique of Judgment, published in 1790, that the pure aesthetic experience consists of disinterested contemplation of an object that pleases for its own sake, without reference to reality or to external ends of utility or mortality. As a self-conscious movement, however, French aestheticism is often said to date from Théophile Gautier's witty defense for his assertion that his art is useless. Aestheticism was developed by Baudelaire who was greatly influenced by Edgar Allan Poe's claim that the supreme work is a poem per se, means a poem written solely for the poem's sake. It was later taken by Flaubert, Malmer, and many other writers in its extreme form. The aesthetic doctrine for art's sake veered into the moral and quasi-religious doctrine of life for art's sake, with the artist represented as a priest who renounces the practical concerns of worldly existence in the service of what Flaubert and others call the religion of beauty. The views of French aestheticism were introduced into Victorian England by Walter Pater with his emphasis on high artistic and stylistic subtlety, his recommendation to crowd one's life with exotic sensations, and his advocacy of supreme value of beauty and of the love for art for its own sake. The artistic and moral views of aestheticism were also expressed in Algernon, Charles Swinburne, and by English writers of the 1890s such as Oscar Wilde, Arthur Symons, and Lionel Johnson, as well as by the artists J.M. Whistler and Aubrey Beardsley. The influence of ideas is stressed in aestheticism, especially in the view of the autonomy, self-sufficiency of a work of art, the emphasis on craft and artistry, and the concept of poem or novel as the end in itself or as invested with intrinsic values has been important in the writings of prominent 20th century authors such as W.B. Yeats, T. Helm, and T.S. Eliot, as well as in the literary theory of the new critics. Now, next term is affective fallacy. In an essay published in 1946, W.K. Wimsatt and Monroe C. Beardsley defined the affective fallacy as an error of evaluating a poem by its effect, especially in its emotional effects upon the reader. As the result of this fallacy, the poem itself as an object of especially critical judgment tends to disappear, so that criticism ends in impressionism and relativism. The two critics wrote in direct reaction to the view of I.A. Richards in his influential Principle of Literary Criticism, published in 1923, that the value of a poem can be measured by the psychological responses in insights in its readers. Beardsley later modified the earlier claim by the admission that it does not appear that critical evaluation can be done at all except in relation to certain types of effect that aesthetic objects have upon their perceivers. So altered, the doctrine becomes a claim for objective criticism, in which the critic, instead of describing the effects of a work, focuses on the features, device, and form of work by which such effects are achieved. An extreme reaction against the doctrine of affective fallacy was manifested during the 1970s in the development of reader response criticism. Next is alienation effect. In his epic theater of 1920s and later, the German dramatist Bertolt Brecht adopted the Russian formalist concept of defamiliarization into what he called the alienation effect. The German term is also translated as estrangement effect or distancing effect. The last is closest to the Brecht's notion is that it avoids the negative connotations of jadedness, incapacity to feel, and social apathy that word alienation has acquired in English. This effect, Brecht said, is used by dramatists to make quid in English. This effect is used by dramatists to make familiar aspect of the present social reality seem strange, so as to prevent the emotional identification or involvement of the audience with the characters and their actions in a play. His aim was to instead to evoke a critical distance and their actions in the play. His aim was instead to evoke critical distance and attitude in the spectators in order to arouse them to take action against, rather than simply to accept, the state of society and behavior represented on the stage. So now next term is alliteration. So alliteration is a repetition of a speech sound in a sequence of nearby words. Usually the term is applied only to consonants and only when the recurrent sound begins a word or stressed syllable within a word. In Old English alliterative meter, alliteration is the principal organizing device of the verse line. The verse is unrhymed. Each line is divided into two half lines of two strong stresses by a decisive pause or caesura, and at least one and usually both of the two stressed syllables in the first half line alliterate with the first stressed syllable of the second half line. In this type of versification, a vowel was considered to alliterate with any other vowel. A number of Middle English poems, such as William Longnet's Piers Plowman and the romance Sir Gawain and his Green Knight, both written in the 14th century, continued to use and play variations upon the old alliterative meter. In the opening line of Piers Plowman, for example, of all four of the stressed syllable alliterate in summer season when soft was sown. In means in summer season when soft was the sun. In later English versification, however, alliteration is used only for special stylistic effects, such as to reinforce the meaning, to link relative words, or to provide tone color and enhance the palpability of enunciating the words. Various other repetition of speech sounds are identified by special terms like consonants. First is consonant. Consonance is the repetition of sequence of two or more consonants, but with a change or in the intervening vowel. Live, love, lean, alone, pitter, patter. So then assonance. Assonance is the repetition of identical or similar vowels, especially in stressed syllables, in a sequence nearly words. Now, next term is allusion. Allusion is a passing reference without explicit identification to literary or historical person, place, or event, or to another literary work or passage. In the Elizabethan Thomas Nash's Litany in Time of Plague, it is written that brightness falls from the air, queens have died young and fair, dust hath closed Helen's eye. The unidentified Helen in the last line alludes to the Helen of Troy. Most allusions serve to illustrate or expand upon the enhance the subject, but some are used in order to undercut it ironically by the discrepancy between the subject and the allusion. So, for discussion of a poet who makes persistent and complex use of this device, they are Alexander Pope in Poetry of Allusion, then John Hollander, The Figure of Echo, a mode of allusion in Milton, and after 1981. So, since allusions are not explicitly identified, they imply a fund of knowledge that is shared by an author and the particular audience for whom the author writes. Most literary allusions are intended to be recognized by generally educated readers of the author's time, but some are aimed at special coterie. So, next term is ambiguity. In ordinary use, ambiguity is applied to a fault in style, that is, the use of a vague or equivocal expression when what is wanted is precision and particularly of reference. Since William Empson published 7 types of ambiguity in 1930, however, the term has been widely adopted in criticism to identify a deliberate poetic device, the use of simple word or expression to signify two or more distinct references or to express two or more diverse attitudes of feelings. Multiple meaning and plurisignation are alternative terms for this use of language. They have the advantage of avoiding the pejorative association with the word ambiguity. When Shakespeare's Cleopatra, exciting to us through frenzy, says in Antony and Cleopatra, Act 5th, Scene 3rd, that come thou mortal wretch, with thy sharp teeth this knot intricate of life at once unite, poor venomous fool, be angry and dispatch. Her speech is richly multiple in the significance. For example, mortal means fatal or death dealing, and at the same time may signify that the asp is itself mortal or subject to death. Wrath in this context serves to express both contempt and pity. Cleopatra goes on to refer to the asp as my baby at my breast, the shucks and the nurse asleep, and the two meanings of dispatch, make haste and kill, are equally relevant. A special type of multiple meaning is conveyed by the Portmanteau word. Portmanteau designates a large suitcase that opens into two equal compartments and was introduced into literary criticism by Humpty Dumpty, the expert of semantics in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, published in 1871. He is exegeting to Alice the meaning of the opening lines of Jabberwocky. Jabberwocky. It was brilliant. Tea was brilliant, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimple in the web. So, slithy, Humpty Dumpty explained, means lithe and slimy. You see it in like a portmanteau. There are two meanings packed up into one word. James Joyce exploited this device also, the fusion of two or more existing words in order to sustain the multiple levels of meaning throughout his long dream narrative wake. An example in his comment on girls who are young and easily frightened. Frightened combines frightened and fried, while young combines young and Sigmund Freud's rival in depth psychology, Carl Jung. So, by his analysis of ambiguity, William Emerson helped make current a mode of explication developed especially by exponents of new criticism, which greatly expanded awareness of his complexity and richness of poetic language. The risk is that the intensive quest for ambiguities will result in overreading, ingenious, overdrawn, and sometimes contradictory explications of literary word or passage. Next term is anti-hero. The chief person in a modern novel or play whose character is widely discrepant from that we associate with the traditional protagonist or hero of a serious literary work. Instead of manifesting largeness, dignity, power, or heroism, the anti-hero is pretty ignominious, passive, clownish, or dishonest. The use of non-heroic protagonists occurs as early as Picaret's novel of the 16th century, and the heroine of Defoe's Moll Flanders, published in 1722, is a thief and prostitute. The term anti-hero, however, is usually applied to writings in the period of delusion after the Second World War, beginning with such protagonists as we find in John Wayne's Hurry On Down, published in 1953, and Kingsley Amis' Lucky Jim, published in 1954. Notable later instances in the novel are Yossarian in Joseph Heller's Catch 22, published in 1961. Humbert in Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, published in 1955, and Tyrone Slothrop in Thomas Pynchon's Gravity Rainbow, published in 1973. The anti-hero is especially conspicuous in dramatic tragedy, in which the traditional protagonist has usually been of high estate, possessing dignity and courage. Extreme instances are the characters who people a world stripped of certainties, values, or even meaning in Samuel Beckett's dramas. The tramps, certainties, values, or even meanings of the tramps Vladimir and Estragon in Waiting for Godot, published in 1952, or blind and paralyzed or old man Ham, who is protagonist in Endgame in 1958. So these are the examples of the anti-hero. Next term is antithesis. Antithesis is a contrast or opposition in the meaning of contiguous phrases or clauses that manifest parallelism, that is, similar word order and structure in their syntax. An example is Alexander Pope's description of Atticus in his epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, published in 1735. The lines are willing to wound and yet afraid to strike. In the antithesis, in the second line of the Pope's description of Baron's designs, that in the Baron's designs in against Belinda's in the Rape of the Lock, published in 1714, the parallelism in the syntax is made prominent by alliteration in the antithetic nouns. Lines are resolved to win, he meditates the way, by force to ravish, or by fraud betray. In the sentences from Samuel Johnson's prose fiction Wrestles, published in 1759, chapter 26, the lines are the antithesis is similarly heightened by alliteration, constrained nouns. The line is, marriage has many pains, but celibacy has no pleasures. This is the example of antithesis. Next term is archaism. the literary use of words and expressions that have become obsolete in the common speech of an era. Spenser's The Fairy Queen, published in 1590 to 96, deliberately employed archaism, many of them derived from Chaucer's medieval English, in the attempt to achieve a poetic style appropriate to his revival of the medical chivalric romance. The translators of King James Version of the Bible, published in 1611, gave weight, dignity, old sonority to their prose by archaic revivals. Both Spenser and King James Bible have in their turn been major sources of archaism for Milton and many later authors. When Keats, for example, in his ode, published in 1820, described the Grecian earth as with braid or marble men and maidens overwrought, he used archaic word for braid and worked that is ornamented all over. Abraham Lincoln achieved a ritualistic solemnity by biblical archaism in his Gettysburg Address, which begins fourscore and 7 years ago. Archaism has been a standard resort for poetic diction through the 19th century. For example, many poets continue to use I ween, me thought, steed, tapper for candle, and morn, but only in their verses, not their everyday speech. Next term is archetypal criticism. In literary criticism, the term archetype denotes recurrent narrative designs, patterns or actions, characters, types, themes, and images which are identifiable in a wide variety of works of literature as well as in myths, dreams, and even social rituals. Such recurrent items are held to be result of elemental and universal forms or patterns in human psyche, whose effective embodiment in a literary work evokes a profound response from tentative reader because he or she shares the psychic archetypes expressed by the author. An important antecedent of the literary theory of archetype was the treatment of myth by a group of comparative anthropologists at Cambridge University, especially James G. Fraser, whose The Golden Bough, published in 1990 and 1915, identify the elemental patterns of myth and rituals that he claimed recur in the legends and ceremonials of diverse and far-flung cultures and religions. Archetypal literary criticism was given impetus by Maud Bodkin's Archetypal Patterns in Poetry, published in 1934, and flourished especially during the 1950s and 1960s. Carl G. Jung, born in 1575, died in 1961, who applied the term archetype to what he called primordial images, the psychic residue or of repeated patterns of experience in our very ancient ancestors, which he maintained survive in the collective unconscious of the human race and are expressed in myth, religion, dreams, and private fantastic, as well as in the works of literature. So, among the prominent practitioners of various modes of archetypal criticism, in addition to Maud Bodkin, were G. Wilson Knight, Robert Graves, Philip Wheelwright, Richard Chase, Leslie Fiedler, and Joseph Campbell. These critics tended to emphasize the occurrence of mythical patterns in literature on the assumption that myths are closer to the elemental archetype than the artful manipulations of the sophisticated writers. The death rebirth theme was often said to be archetype or archetypes and was held to be grounded in the cycle of the seasons and the organic cycle of human lives. This archetype, it was claimed, occurs in primitive rituals of king who is annually sacrificed in widespread myths of god who die to be reborn, and in a multitude diverse texts including Bible, Dante's Divine Comedy in the early 14th century, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Rime of Ancient Mariner, published in 1798. In his remarkable and influential book Anatomy of Criticism, published in 1957, Northrop Frye developed the archetypal approach, which he combined with the typological interpretation of the Bible and the conception of the imagination in the writings of the poet and painter William Blake, who was born in 1757 and died in 1827, into a radical and comprehensive revision of traditional grounds both in the theory of literature and the practice of literary criticism. Then Frere continued in a long series of later writings to expand his archetypal theory to make a place in its overall scope and on different levels, for including many traditional critical concepts and procedures, and to apply in both to social practices and to the elucidation of writings ranging from the Bible to contemporary poets and novelists. So next term is atmosphere. Atmosphere is the emotional tone pervading a section or the whole of a literary work, which fosters in the reader expectations as to the course of events, whether happy or more commonly terrifying or disastrous. Establishes Shakespeare establishes the tense and fearful atmosphere at the beginning of the Hamlet by the terse and nervous dialogue of the sentinels as they anticipate a reappearance of the ghost. Coleridge engenders a compound of religions and superstitions terror by his description of initial scenes in the narrative poem Christabel, published in 1816. And Hardy, in his novel The Return of the Native, published in 1828, makes a Egdo Heth, a brooding presence, and that reduces the pettiness and futility of the human struggle for happiness, for which it is setting. It is the setting. Alternative terms frequently used for atmosphere are mood and French word ambience. Last term is author and authorship. So the prevailing conception of literary author might be summarized as follow. Authors are the individuals who by their intellectual and imaginative powers purposefully create from their experience and reading a literary work which is distinctively their own. The work itself, as distinguished from the written or printed text that instantiate the work, remains a product accredited to the author as its originator, even if he or she turns over the rights to publish or profits from the printed text to someone else. And insofar as the literary work turns out to be great and original, the author who has composed that work is deservedly accorded high cultural status and achieves lasting fame. So this is all about the author and authorship. Now this is all about the literary terms. Thanks a lot for watching this video. If you like this video, please do comment, subscribe the channel, share the video, and thanks a lot for watching this video.